We are sometimes told that the loss of manufacturing jobs has been compensated by more service sector jobs, people like hairdressers, window cleaners and estate agents. But there is a problem with service sector jobs. Many of the things we want to buy are manufactured outside Britain. To pay for them, we need to sell things abroad, and most service sector jobs don't travel.
Well, the problem is it's very hard to export services. You can't very well shine somebody's shoes or do somebody's laundry unless they live near you. So typically you export product.
What's more, many of the new service sector workers are in regions which are largely supported by public money. They are what economists call secondary tax consumers.
You've got hundreds of thousands of jobs at the moment in Britain that derive all their revenues really from the public sector. They are hidden public sector jobs, which means the real size of the state sector when it comes to employment is even larger than we think at the moment.
Politicians sometimes say we shouldn't worry about a big public sector because public spending stimulates economic growth. Let's see if it's true. The trouble is, as we have seen, the government's only source of money is us. The taxman is visiting Roger the restaurant owner and taxing him £50. The £50 comes directly out of Roger's profits. Roger's £50 is then given in wages to a government employee. As it happens, this public servant feels like treating himself to a lavish French meal and graciously decides to patronise Roger's establishment. The bill comes to £50, which, given the cost of fish and foie gras these days, our public servant considers very reasonable. The government has returned every penny of Roger's tax to him in new business. But how stimulating does he find this? Roger's business is not more profitable, but less. In the end, he'll have no more money in the till than when he started, but now he's had to pay for extra food and wine and the chef's time. Government spending has left him not richer, but poorer.
The government's always talking about putting more money into the economy, stimulating the economy with more money. But where does that money come from? The answer is that it comes from the rest of us.
All of the government's money has to come from the private sector. That's what generates wealth. That's the only thing that there is to tax. There isn't any sort of magic pot of gold in the back garden at number 10 Downing Street.
I decided to run this past some of Britain's most powerful and enthusiastic supporters of state spending, starting with the head of the TUC, Brendan Barber.
But you're taking money out of the productive economy, and then you say you spend a little money of that money back in the productive economy. How is that stimulating?
Well, if we'd not seen the extra spending from government in the face of recession, I think the recession would have been very much worse, and we'd have seen unemployment go higher.
But the extra spending comes from the productive economy, doesn't it?
Well, of course.
The construction industry in this country would be on its knees if it wasn't for public sector works at the moment, because there's precious little private sector investment.
But aren't they just secondary tax consumers? I mean, I think the point that people find confusing is that governments talk as if they've got an independent source of money, when in fact it's our money. What you're saying is you can better spend our money than we can.
The only source of money that the public sector has is basically through taxes, one way or another.
The government doesn't have its own money, does it?
No, of course. I mean, the government is responsible for managing the public finances, and those public finances come from tax revenues.
Let's take another example. The government decides to build a shiny new office building and another 90,000 road humps. To do this, they employ private firms. The trouble is, the money to pay for it, and more, comes from tax levied on other sections of the productive economy.
The idea that the government of the day actually creates growth, creates prosperity, is the reverse of the truth.
You can clearly point at something the government's done. We've given you this job, or we've built that building. But if you're taking that money, I would say, out of the economy, out of the private economy, because you're taxing people's income or taxing products or taxing corporations, that's money that those individuals, that those shopkeepers, that those corporations don't have to build their own buildings.
Trying to stimulate the productive economy with public spending paid for with money taken out of the productive economy, is like treating a patient by extracting blood out of one arm, spilling a great deal of it, and then injecting what's left into the other arm. The idea that public spending will stimulate growth is the biggest myth of the 20th century, and it's the cause of Britain's economic decline. The burden of paying for the public sector rests entirely on the private sector. A bigger public sector means higher taxes, and higher taxes means lower profits. We've reached the point now where Britain's supersized state is actually bigger than the private sector that supports it. The government spends more than all private individuals and companies put together. In some regions, a lot more. It is estimated that the state now accounts for more than 60% of the economy in Scotland. In the North East it's 73%. In Wales it's 77%. And in Northern Ireland the state accounts for a staggering 81% of the economy.
When you've got to 70% of GDP public sector, that's worse even than what you had in a lot of Eastern European countries in the 1980s when these countries were officially communist.
Once a state gets to the sorts of size it is at the moment, of spending over 50% of national income, it becomes very difficult to reduce it.
One of the problems with government when it gets very large is that there's a vast number of interest groups who are feeding from the public trough.
The more people there are who owe their living to the state, then the more electors there are who are going to vote for an even larger state.
The vested interests that live off the state can become a majority of the electorate. And we're very close to that situation now.
So what's it like in those old manufacturing regions of Britain that now survive on vast quantities of public money? I've decided to go home to the North East, where I grew up. Anyone who believes that huge amounts of public spending will stimulate economic growth should come here. The North East burst into life with the Industrial Revolution. It started with coal, but to bring up the coal and send it on its way required other stuff. Iron and timber, docks and cranes, rope making and shipbuilding, and newfangled railways. I'm playing guide to author and expert in economic geography, Dr. Richard Wellings.
What do you think of all this? Well, it's a shame that these sort of great old commercial buildings have now been sort of put to pretty low-grade uses.
The little businesses that are in there, you can't imagine them actually being able to build the buildings that they're occupying.
No, that's right. It's from a tremendous boom time for Newcastle.
I mean, just the number of fantastic buildings that were going up within 10, 20 years.
That's right.
That one you think is probably late 18th century, but most of the others, you're talking kind of middle part of the 19th century for the most part?
Yes, in those days, of course, the state was tiny, less than 10% of the economy.
So tiny little state.
That's right.
And so they didn't have lots of kind of regional development officers with their glossy brochures saying, come to Newcastle.
No, it was all done by the private sector. Entrepreneurs did this. It's sort of a very vibrant, bustling sort of place, full of ideas, full of innovation. And of course now it's just a sort of shade of its former glory.
So what about the mighty northern industry that paid for these wonderful buildings? Well, it can still be seen today, in a museum. The Northeast was one of the world's first industrial powerhouses. High wages drew people from far and wide to work here, like my own ancestors, who came from Ireland.
Welcome to the olden days, Richard.
Yes.
This was the tiger economy of the age, wasn't it? The first tiger economy. We were the first tiger economy.
And I mean, I would say that if we'd had sort of today's levels of high taxes and regulation, it would never have happened.
The difference in the standard of living for ordinary people from the beginning of the 19th century to the end of the 19th century, fantastic change.
Yeah, standards of living over the 19th century have improved immensely.
Which is why we see that huge explosion of population.
Yes.
People are just living.
That's right.
Instead of dying and living longer.
Yes, you had more or less universal literacy by 1900 as well, whereas in 1800 it was... Yeah. Probably most people were illiterate. So.
With mass production came mass consumption. What were once luxuries enjoyed by the few became affordable and common.
You have factory production of clothes. Ordinary people can look rather smart for the first time in history.
Well, yes, I mean, an ordinary person in 1900 would probably, dress in finer clothing than some sort of the aristocrats 200 or 300 years before then. And it wasn't, that long after the 19th century that electricity started to become commonplace, and the huge advances in plumbing and so on. It just transformed people's living environments.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain was the workshop of the world. We were the first industrial nation. But in the 20th century, Britain became a pioneer of a different kind. We decided to nationalise huge chunks of the economy. Now we led the world in high taxation and big government spending, and places like the Northeast paid the price.
So when did things start to go wrong?
Well, I think it was quite a long process, but I would date sort of the main decline from maybe the First World War and the following decades. That's when we had the huge growth in government.
The First World War cost them an awful lot of money, obviously. They borrowed vast amounts for that.
That's right.
They're taxing heavily to pay for the war and to pay for the interest on what they're borrowing for the war. So could you just explain to me how big government spending affects profits, how it affects commercial enterprise?
Well, it makes an entrepreneurship a lot less worthwhile if you don't actually get to keep the profits that you've made. So there's that impact on incentives to start with.
So there's no incentive to invest, and also there's less ability to invest because you haven't got the profits to invest.
Exactly, that's right.
As the burden of supporting the